Thank you, and welcome everyone, and good afternoon. Yeah, I noticed in the program they spelled my first name incorrectly, which is very, very rare considering my last name. But I do have a brother named Dave Ladouceur, so that's very fitting. Yeah, so I'm going to present on navigating state rules and land development. You know, one of the things that we've recognized in our program is that local health departments are increasingly faced with evaluating land that has to meet applicable state rules. So that's going to be my objective today. And so, you know, we're all in this together, you know, and it's always best to work together, you know, moving forward, paddling in the same direction. And so this session will cover, you know, regulatory acts that connect to the rules that pertain to land divisions, land developments, and those kind of things. And I'll bring in some examples that I've worked with, or our program has worked with local health departments on, some specific examples of how we've assisted. And the agenda, I'm going to start with some history of dividing land to what's called the Subdivision Control Act, then transition to the Condominium Act and some general framework regarding condominiums. I'm going to touch on condominium development and some terms related to it, and some more about condominiums. Followed by condominium review process, and then I have this deeper category: land division acts, subdivisions, land divisions, and less than 1 acre parcels, and some terminology I'm going to touch on as well. So, you know, what this is the administrative rules. These administrative rules, and this is a printed version, the first edition. We don't print these anymore. And it is available on our website. But these are the administrative rules that apply to land development that is not served by public water and public sewer. And what I mean by land development, certain land divisions, subdivisions, and condominium projects. And so the effective date of the rules was February 8th, 2001. And you know, prior to these rules, there were guidelines, state guidelines for specific developments, and that's a whole nother discussion. I'm not going to get into that. However, any reference I make to rules is going to be a reference to this, okay? So what you're seeing here is a developing timeline, selection of statutes pertaining to land development or dividing land. And so in the following slides, I'm breaking this timeline down into segments to, you know, address specific acts. And so I'm going to start with history. I like bringing in the history into the discussion. It's a transitional piece for me. I've been in the program so long, I'm actually part of the history. But this here is a map of Michigan territory. Michigan land development began, you know, 200 plus years ago when Michigan was defined as a territory. And so this map here is from 1822, and although laws were enacted subsequent to this time that were directed to protection of public health, you know, it took almost 150 years after this time in which to do that. So as early as 1821, there was an act bringing in territorial law. Not so much an act, but just a law that identified when towns were created. The proprietor was required to cause a true map or plat to be created and recorded. So we have early documentation of land being developed or divided. But again, it was so early, you know, the public health measures did not come into play. When the rural population in Michigan got to be about 1.5 million people, the Platt Act of 1929 was enacted. And it provided no provisions for suitability of lots for on-site water, on-site sewage. And so with this image here, you can see 1930 is the date up there. This is actually a plat in Sanilac County that was recorded in 1930. And so these lots here are 20 feet wide, 100 feet long, and there's over 1,000 of them in this image right here.
Whoa. You said 20 feet wide?
20 feet wide.
Get your tent in there,
Yeah. So yeah, and I could go on. This is in a township that had issues regarding sewage. Yeah. Its proximity to Lake Huron was a problem. And so next in that series of land development timeline is the Subdivision Control Act. And so the Subdivision Control Act came in effect January 1 of 1968. And so it was the first act for land development that brought in considerations and requirements for public health. It had provisions for acceptable water supply and acceptable sewage disposal for platted land. And so what I highlighted here, it's hard to see, is this is a plat in Oakland County, and it's from 1970. And so when the Subdivision Control Act came into effect, it set forth the review requirements for individual water supplies, wastewater or sewage systems, and it was placed, the review authority was with the state of Michigan. And so at that time, 1970, I captured this, and I got this from the state website through Licensing and Regulatory Affairs that has all the plats, all the recorded subdivisions. And so I found this one, and right in here, it identifies the plat had recorded restrictions as required by Michigan Department of Public Health. So this was the predecessor to local health department being involved in this process, or this area of the program. So next we're gonna move to the Condominium Act. So the Condominium Act of 1978, it established regulations for condominium development ownership. Over the years, it was expanded and amended to more clearly clarify requirements or provisions for developers of the condominium projects, associations, condominiums, co-owner responsibilities and such. But of significance was an amendment to the Condominium Act that occurred in 1983. Okay, and that 1983 amendment connected condominium development to the Subdivision Control Act rules regarding public health, drinking water, and sewage systems. And so we're going to look more closely at the amendment in later slides. Oops. So this slide is, what are condominiums? In essence, a condominium is not a type of building. It's a form of ownership of real property with identified rights and shared use. There's no state enforcing agency, though LARA, Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, has on their website information regarding condominiums. They have what's called a condominium buyer's handbook. So there is information there. LARA's role is to maintain the condominium buyer's handbook, also forward any complaints regarding condominiums to the developer, and they assist in providing information on folks that are seeking remedies regarding condominium development. So here we have the amendment to the Condominium Act in 1983. And so this is the specific section that was brought in. This is Section 71A in the Condominium Act, and it identifies that the rules applicable to a condominium project served by public water and public sewers have to meet site suitability requirements of the Subdivision Control Act. So, I want to touch on condominium terminology. terminology becomes critically important when our program is assisting local health departments in a review of projects. Whether they're current projects or past projects, understanding the terminology and where they apply is very, very important. And so within the Condominium Act, we have the term condominium unit, and I'm just going to read from it just to cover it all. It means that portion of the condominium project designed and intended for separate ownership and use. Another important term is a condominium subdivision plan. This means drawings and information prepared pursuant to a specific section in the Condominium Act. And Regina's going to use, I think, some of these terms and expand a little bit about the condominium documents and related items. Conversion condominium. Now, it means a condominium project containing condominium units, some or all of which were occupied before filing a notice of taking reservations under what's called Section 71. And so it's important to know that conversion condominiums is defined as a project such as this, where they need to be occupied before they file notice. But we are seeing conversions occurring on projects that have never been occupied and never will be occupied potentially. And so it is problematic. In many instances, the condominium conversions are occurring without any local health department review ahead of it, and it's problematic. Some additional terminology. General common elements means common elements other than limited common elements, and limited common elements are the critical piece when looking at condominium projects that are proposed to be served by individual on-site systems. And I'll expand on that a little bit more here. The master deed is a document recording the condominium project to which are established exhibits and incorporated by reference the bylaws for the project and the condominium subdivision plan and other documents. Excuse me. So what is a site condominium? I love this slide. So in the 1980s, Michigan Department of Public Health introduced the term site condominium. And at that time, the term was to refer to condominium projects that were served by on-site systems that resembled a single-family residential development. The term is non-identified in any state legislation. I'm not a fan of the term because the Act reads condominium projects. It doesn't define it. And so when a condominium's project not served by public water, public sewer, it begins to channel it to these rules regardless of whether or not it's a site condominium. Yeah, this is me, 1988. That's my youngest daughter. She turns 35 next month. And so, yeah, site condo, really, again, the intention was to identify single-family residential that resembled a subdivision served by individual. Here we find we have, a single-family residence is identified as a site condo. It's got public water and public sewer. It doesn't meet what was intended for a site condo. Another thing we have here is, and it's hard to see, it's dark, a site condominium is storage units. And so we see these and it raises the question, what kind of facilities does this site condominium have? Is it served by individual systems? Is there a community system, shared water supplies? All kinds of questions start coming up. So this is an illustration that tries to identify somewhat clearly what limited common elements are within what's considered a so-called site condominium. And so these yellow lines are pointing to what are identified as a boundary area around a specific unit, and that is the limited common element that is under the exclusive use and control of that unit owner. And so under our rules, it's easiest to apply things like isolation distances to property lines, because that's what these rules speak to, isolation distances to structure, but more so, it allows an area or areas to be identified for individual on-site systems. In this case, septic tank, initial replacement system, a water well, all on a site that is under the exclusive use and control of that owner. In this instance, the general common element are common areas. And here it's a road. It could be a park. Just common areas within a development that are under shared ownership through the condominium association. It's a quirk. Condominiums where the buildings are the unit boundaries. These they do show up. They showed up quite a bit a decade or more ago. I was seeing them quite often. But what this is we don't have any unit boundary areas defined. And so when we see these, it points to association ownership, not individual systems under exclusive use and control unit owner. And so it moves into another area of being evaluated for, community or shared systems under association. So it shifts it to not individual, but more of a public system setup. Development trends. What I've seen and what our program sees is creative developers trying to maximize land development. And so, multiple dwellings or commercial buildings on land that was historically, organized for one single family residence. It could be a mixed development with both residential and commercial. The most common that we see is what we call attached condominiums. Okay, if you can envision a duplex, and I may have a slide here. I can't remember. Well, actually, I'm going to point to it here. So if you can envision this as a duplex, this would be in a condominium development would be attached condominium, attached from the standpoint that it shares a common wall. And so we see a lot of these occurring. And in some instances, and I'm going to back up. In some instances, it could be such that if we had these butting up to each other, that common wall could be a defining point to establish that boundary area. So and I don't have a good example, but if one met two at the wall, then this line between the two could be a limited common element to that half of one and the other to number two, if you can envision that. And I think Regina might have better examples than me. Condominium Act and review process. So, there are statutory provisions, and I mentioned, Section 71, and I mentioned Section 71A. 71 is what's called a notice of action. It's a notice of proposed action, and we use the term notice of intent. And so, as part of the Condominium Act and part of the condominium development process, notice of intent is issued when a condominium project is either going to be developed or there's going to be sales of units. And I'm going to not go any deeper than that because I'm certain Regina's going to cover it. But because there's no state agency overseeing condominiums, there's no state agency flow chart. There's no process that is set that is easy to follow. And I'll get to the subdivision part of the Land Division Act when I get there because it's very clear. It's very clear. And so what I wanted to say here, again, no flow chart or order of events. The next slide, this is a suggested flow chart that we put together for local health departments for review and approval of a condominium project. And so the upper portion of it, is the typical stuff a health department would go through is getting an application, getting a review for suitability, working with a consultant for the developer, getting all that stuff set up, and then working out anything, deficiencies until it gets to a point where it's going to move to an approval. And moving to approval means you've got copies of the subdivision condominium plat and plan and other information that's required in essence under these rules. And so once a health department has all the required information and has determined that it meets the suitability under the rules, then we move to issuing a preliminary approval letter. And typically that preliminary approval letter has with it documents that need to be recorded or reviewed. And so once that review process is completed, oftentimes it's identified that we need to have restrictions or advisories. It could be information related to water supply suitability, well depth restrictions, those kind of things. And so once those documents are created and received by the local health department, and they take a look at it and they say, okay, yeah, we've got the copy of the recorded deed restrictions and advisories, meaning the health department's requesting it, and the proof is in the pudding. So once all that process works through, we've done the review, we have all the documents, we ask for certain things to be recorded. When the recorded master deed and restrictions and advisories come back to the health department, then and only then is the health department in a position to issue final approval. Condominium Act, Notice of Proposed Action, that's that notice of intent under Section 71. The act and the notification identifies, in essence, the local unit of government, road commission, county drain commissioner. Yeah, the act still says the Department of Environmental Quality, and then the state transportation department. And so the local health department's not part of the notice of intent process. And so what happens is, Eagle, when we look at these things and we see them, we identify when there's an on-site component. If it's being proposed to be served by individual water wells or individual sewage systems, we communicate that to the local health department. Okay? And yes, we often receive multiple copies of the same information. What we've asked is if a health department gets one of those and we haven't had communication about that, meaning we didn't send it to you, we'd appreciate if you could share it with us, because that way we know and they've met their obligations. But it serves, in some instances, as the first indication that something's going on. Sometimes these notice of intents occur without the health department ever stepping foot on the site. Other times they come at the tail end. I had a conversation with Kyle. I said, hey, our office sent you a notice of intent. He said, oh yeah, I'm aware of it. I'm aware of that project, and we're going to work to assist them in any way we can. But he knew it. He was on top of it. That doesn't always happen. So from the developing timeline, we moved to the Land Division Act. And so Land Division Act, it amended the Subdivision Control Act, okay? And so it became effective in March 31 of 1997. It broadened the applicability of state rules to any land division, requiring local municipality review. Without going into details, because I could go down a rabbit hole sometimes, it created a serious, I'll use the word hardship, but more of a concern, a problem for developers and realtors, because the process just said, it has to have health department review and approval before land could be divided. And I'll just kind of stop right there. That was, I'll say, a non-starter. But it took 6 months, and the Land Division Act got amended. And so here we have the Land Division Act.
Dale?
Yeah.
That date that you have, that March 31st,
Yeah.
there's a July date that always.
I'm getting there. Yes. Yes. That's why I said 6 months later, after this March date, if I did my math right, maybe I did. A few months later, okay, yeah, Dale was never, yeah, okay. So, yeah, I will touch on that, but what I wanted to bring out here, this section 105G is the elements of the Land Division Act that were carried over from the Subdivision Control Act, okay? So the rules relating to suitability of groundwater for on-site water supplies, For subdivisions not served by public water, and the same thing for suitability of soils for subdivisions not served by public sewer, is the connection to individual on-site systems for land development, for certain land development. Let me clarify that. But this is the section that the Condominium Act specifically connects to, okay? Is Section 105G. And so under 105G, it also states the department, the state, I think it reads Department of Environmental, actually it might read Department of Public Health, may authorize the city, county, or district health department to carry out provisions. So that's the transfer of the oversight of that program area from the state to the local health department is under 105G. So, the Land Division Act defines many terms, and I included 3 here that are, become very important. And I bring them in because terminology is quite important. And so I'm just going to go over them. A lot means a measured portion of a parcel or tract of land which is described in a recorded plat. It is described in a subdivision. Okay? It doesn't pertain to any other form of land development specific to subdivision. A plat means a chart or a map of subdivision of land, and a preliminary plat means a map showing salient features of a proposed subdivision submitted to an approving authority for purposes of preliminary consideration. Now, many local health departments, have staff that have never worked through a subdivision plat. Condominiums are the development we see, and I'll get to why. And so this is potentially why. This is the flow chart for subdivision or land division that articulates very clearly the process. Okay, there are 15 steps prescribed in reviewing a subdivision plat, and it could include up to 8 different entities. There's an order of process. It's a time-consuming process which had moved developers to favor condominium development. It's quick, it's easy, and it has no state oversight. Okay, so from, again, the developing timeline, we're gonna move to the Land Division Act amendment that changed the approval process. So that's where July of 1997 comes into play. So this is when Section 109A was brought into the Land Division Act. And so it specifically applies to parcels less than an acre, created after this date. The other part of it, and I'll get to it in the next slide, but before I get there, I want to bring in the term parcel, because that's the term that applies to the land division elements of the Land Division Act, whereas the other terms apply to subdivision development under the Land Division Act. And so it means a continuous area of land which can be described as provided for in this act. The term does not apply to a condominium development. So here we have Section 109A, the beginning of rules applicable to parcels less than an acre. For newly created parcels created after this date, prior to a building permit, and this is taken from that section of the Land Division Act, approval by the local health department is needed for the suitability of on-site systems, okay, before a building permit is issued. It doesn't always happen. And also, under Section 109A, it gives, maybe I should just read it. It holds a municipality harmless, okay? So a municipality approving a division, in essence less than an acre, in size, is not liable if a building permit's not issued. It's a real bad way of doing business because it puts a potential homeowner or future landowner in a real bind when a parcel that's less than an acre is approved without the local health department being a part of that process and a building permit not being issued. So essentially, the notice protects the municipality. Important here is parcel create date. And so when looking at land divisions less than an acre, it becomes critically important to identify through the municipality when was that created. Because that's the defining line to that July 97 date, July 28th. Anything before that doesn't have to meet these less than 1 acre land division requirements for suitability under state rules. Yeah.
I just had some come to me on one of the small lakes out near my house, and of course they proposed like splits that were half the size of an acre, and I'm like, I knew the area and the exact location. I'm like, I kind of twist them a little bit to say, kind of, like, you're going to be running into some severe headaches here if I got to look at this with a different set of package rules,
Right.
So here's my proposal to you. You might want to come back with an acre on those, and they came back and split it into 4 separate parcels.
Okay. So the question that you have concerns splitting of land on a lake, and whether or not it has to meet the state rules because it's being communicated as less than an acre. Am I understanding that correctly?
There are other factors that would have
Okay.
weighed in.
So
That half acre would have been a quarter acre.
And this would be the type of situation or scenario I would start asking for more information, because I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of platted lots, old platted lots under the Subdivision Control Act that don't become parcels if they decide to split lots or combine lots. It doesn't create a parcel under the Act. And I see that when we have this discussion on terminology. You talk about a split. Is it a split or is it a land division? Split often refers to dividing a lot in a platted subdivision. So I start asking questions, are we talking about an actual land division, or are we talking about a platted land? And that just moves into a different area of the Land Division Act that we're not going to go into today.
They came back and said these are just these small splits, all just 1 acre in size, and reduce the amount of them. Local sanitary roads then would take over, correct? If they were more than an acre and they weren't part of a plat, so to speak, but just basic land division.
I didn't hear. I'm trying to capture a couple things here. So if the division is that occurs, let's say it occurs today, and it creates a parcel that's greater than an acre, this doesn't come into play. Okay?
Unless they don't have that number of splits available. You can always split properties so many times over a period of time.
Yeah.
And the local units of government that do the land divisions, there isn't a state agency that's overseeing to make sure they're following the Land Division Act.
But that's not our responsibility.
It is not the local health department's responsibility, but there are times where local health departments catch it and identify, hey,
Yeah.
you're trying to split this 10 ways, you couldn't possibly do that, you don't have that many splits available on 4 acres.
Well, and like I said, I don't know how many splits are available on a given parcel for many years. I mean,
The
Yeah.
township.
if we know that.
Yeah, it is the responsibility of the municipality to determine what splits are available and to be able to allow them to be legally divided.
Right.
Okay?
Now, let me ask you this, Dale. If someone brought you a subdivision plan, or basically they want to create a subdivision with parcels that were over an acre, but wanted to call it subdivision versus meets and bounds splits
It would be a subdivision, it would be a plat.
under these rules?
No. Subdivision platted land falls under a different section of the Land Division Act, okay? It is, platted land is not a parcel, and so the door doesn't get open to become a parcel less than an acre, okay?
Do you mean a new subdivision or an existing one?
I would just say, what if someone said, I'm gonna call this the such and such subdivision, but I want them all 1.5 acres in size, and it actually is registered as a subdivision.
Again,
County or township level.
subdivisions, to be a subdivision has to go through the platting process.
Right, but as far as the on-site systems, if it is on, if they were more than an acre, follow our local sanitary code, or because it's a
No.
subdivision?
No, that's a good, I'm glad you pushed it a little bit further. Anytime you're dealing with platted land under the Land Division Act, it triggers the review under these rules.
Even though those parcels were.
Even though those parcels, they could have a 5-acre parcel. If it's part of a plat, it triggers a review under these rules. Good question.
That's what I had.
Is that the question you had, Kyle? Okay. Okay, I think we're making some headway. So, yeah, they can be challenging. This is one I'm going to throw at you that might be challenging, but it might not be, because some of you folks in the room have some experience. And so here we have a land division survey, 2 parcels. Okay, and it's hard to see, so I kind of moved it forward. And so when looking at land divisions and parcels, and these come in as small parcels, they're hard to see, and I'll have to get close to read them. But this parcel here is 1.19 acres. This parcel here has 2 things indicated, 0.98 acres to the traverse line and 1.5 acres to what's called the ordinary high water mark. So in looking at this, parcels of land are surveyed to the water's edge. That's in the Land Division Act. And so this one here is clearly over an acre, and I had a health department asking about this one. What about this one? It's 0.8.
Is that the one Don told you?
Yeah.
He and I looked at that before we talked.
So, this traverse line here is used for the purposes, it's a way to establish a point to do measures from. Let's say, for instance, the site gets developed. It gives them something to measure to, and it relieves having to have a jagged edge to the water, okay? It is accepted to bring in this traverse line, but the traverse line is within the parcel. It is not where the parcel ends. So in this case, it's over an acre. So I kind of got off track here a little bit. So you want to identify parcel sizes first, and so we did that. And so we look for a date on a survey, which can be helpful, and we look for other documentation, such as a date created. We brought that term in. And so the date of the survey is 2005, and then it was revised in 2019. The other documentation that would be beneficial in this, and I can't recall the conversation we might have had with Don or you, Dave, is to confirm with the municipality, when was it divided. Just because you're provided with a survey doesn't necessarily represent that that's when the parcel was created. All right. So here we have another one. Land division survey, 2 parcels. And so in this case, we want to figure out what the parcel sizes are. And so I shot it out there. These are 0.37 acres each. Yeah. Yeah. So then we want to take a look at, well, what is there a date of the survey? February 25, 1997. Yeah. Well, it was surveyed in 97. Right. So it does, you're asking the right questions. And so you have to dig deeper. You have to, check in with the municipality, or if you find additional information, I'm going to back it up. Because what I didn't expand on is over here. This is Register of Deeds recording of that document. And the date is March 28, 1997. Would this be reviewed under state rules? It would not. It predates that July change.
Unless they didn't have the number of splits available.
Regina brings up a good point. Unless they didn't have available splits to do this. But I'm going to back it up, because in this case, it predates the March 31, 1997 date of the Land Division Act that set those splits in motion. So, yeah, it can become rather interesting.
as is.
You know, the interesting thing is combining land does not constitute a division. And so what becomes critically important is, you know, can systems fit? You know, can it logically fit if you're talking an individual sewage system, a well, and all required isolation distances? That becomes a big issue. Yeah. Pardon? 8 minutes. Tick, tick, tick. So we're going to try to wrap it up real quick. This is the area of the developing timeline that really needs to be focused on. It's the effective date of the change in the Condominium Act moving to the effective date of the Land Division Act. So those are the triggers that you should be aware of. Key points: terminology is critically important when communicating on land development projects. Terms, terminology, lots apply to subdivision plats. Parcels apply to land divisions. Units apply to condominium development. They're not interchangeable. For less than 1 acre land divisions, knowing the date the parcel was created is critically important. And so when discussing projects with our Eagle staff, you know, don't be surprised if we start asking for more information. I need more information, because that helps us clarify, are we talking the same type of development, whether it's a condominium, subdivision, parcel less than 1 acre. So we often do that. Overview and process timing, it depends on the form of the land development. Parcels less than 1 acre created under the Act, Section 109A. We confirm the prior to a building permit needs to have an acceptable, you know, local health department approval before, you know, the permit gets issued, building permit gets issued. Create date, again, critical piece. Subdivisions and plats have an orderly process, again, because it's time consuming. Folks are not moving in that direction. Condominium projects, ideally, you know, they're reviewed before they're recorded. You know, the local health department's engaged in that approval process. And the notice of intent can serve as an indicator to notify health department, hey, something's going on. I'm going to open up for questions here. Land development involves many variable uses of applicable statutes. I'm reading this, difficult. Anyway, there's too much to cover in just an hour. You can see I got them pulling at me. So